Weathering with watercolor pencils. Now, weathering with watercolor pencils is not something new by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, AK Interactive has their own product on the market specifically made for this. Although the problem with them is that they do tend to run a little high as far as cost goes. So that got me thinking, what if I went on Amazon and I picked up a set of regular old run-of-the-mill watercolor pencils? Would that work as well as the ones that are quote-unquote specifically formulated for modeling? Well, in this video we're gonna find out. So this is one of the larger sets of watercolor pencils that I could find at a fairly affordable price on Amazon. It's put out by Fantasia, and at the time of recording, it runs about $16. Now, as you can see, it will give you a wide variety of shades to choose from, which is good, because you never know when you're going to need this or what you're going to need them for. And in this video, we're going to be working on the Death Guard's Plagueburst Crawler from Games Workshop. And here's one I prepared earlier. And we're going to be doing a little bit of copper verdigris and a little bit of rust and grime, and these are two of my favorite things. So let's go ahead and jump straight into it. First things first, get your water out. Since it is water-based paint, it's not really going to work without it. I like to keep a bottle of distilled water handy. Now, the reason I use distilled water and not tap water is because distilled water can stand for a much longer time without going stale and developing all kinds of nasty stuff in it. So the first color we're going to start with here is this nice icy greenish tint, and as you can see, it's pretty much a dead ringer for Games Workshop's Nylak Oxide. So there's a few techniques we're going to be using today to apply the pigment. The first one we're doing right now, and that is when we dip the tip of the pencil in water to wet it and then apply the wet pigment directly from the pencil to the model's surface. Afterwards, we're going to come in with a paintbrush with water on it and float it around the surface and move it into place where we'd like for the pigment to settle. Now, it's important when you're working like this to keep in mind where water would settle on the surface and where we'd see a lot of oxidization happening. Now it's time to do some blending. The first thing you want to do is to get some water on your brush. The next step is super simple. In this case, we're just going to use the water on the brush to move the pigment around on the surface and let it settle where we want it to sit. Later, we're going to take a look at how to actually create fades and blend. So as you can see, we're just moving the brush around on the surface, blending in a little bit here and there, kind of making sure that the pigment goes where we want it. Now, you might find yourself asking, why not just use Nylak Oxide? Well, I find that using Nylak Oxide on metallics is not my favorite thing. It contains a lot of medium and a lot of matte medium, and a lot of times, if you're not careful, it can really kill the shine of the metallics, which is why we're doing what we're doing today and substituting the Nylak Oxide for a watercolor pencil to achieve the same effect. So you just want to keep at it and working that pigment on there, moving it around, applying more pigment, and if you want, vary the shades a little bit until you find a result that you're pretty happy with. Weathering is not something that should be rushed, and it does take time, but in the end, the effect is worth the effort put into it. So let's take a look at a couple of other ways of applying pigment to your model. What I really love about using watercolor pencils is that the method of application completely changes the outcome of the look. As you can see here, rather than getting the pigment directly from the pencil to the model, we're picking up pigment using our paintbrush and applying it onto a model in more of like a wash technique. The good thing about this is that it really lets you get into those nooks and crannies where you wouldn't be able to get the pencil tip in. And since we're working with watercolors, if you happen to make a mistake, you can simply just come in with water and clean it up. So let's talk about one of my absolute favorite things about this technique. And that is the ability to fade and blend really easily. Now, getting a crispy, nice fade sounds like it's complicated, but really it isn't. And I'm gonna show you the secret sauce to that technique. Again, we're back to applying the pigment directly from the pencil. The only difference is that this time we're going to be a lot more careful when we're moving the pigment around on the surface using our paintbrush. It's a good idea to localize where you're working down to a small area so you're not jumping all over the model trying to catch up with yourself when doing this technique. Now it's time to do the actual blending and fading. The trick to this is really simple. The first thing you want to do is pre-wet your brush. And make sure you're not coming into this with a completely soaking wet brush, so it's a good idea to have a piece of paper or something to wick away the excess moisture. Next up, we're going to be applying water to the surface where the pigment is not, and we're going to work our way into the pigment. Don't lift your brush. That is the absolute most important thing about this technique. Do not lift your brush from the surface while you're doing this. You're going to work into the pigment, barely touch into it, and then slowly pull backwards while you're continuing to move the brush around on the surface. I like to do a sideways motion, kind of zigzagging the pigment over the surface. And what's happening here is that since you already wet the surface, that pigment is going to flow a lot better over the surface, and the further away you get from the source, the less pigment is going to be left on the brush. And that is basically the whole technique in a nutshell. Super simple, nothing to it. Anybody can do this. Just sit down and try it. I promise you, you'll have wonderful results. So we've covered floating the pigments around on the surface. We've covered fading and blending. Now what about streaking? This is weathering after all, so let's take a look at some streaks. Now first things first, you want to grab a larger brush than normal. I recommend something like a number 10 filbert like you see me using here, but pretty much any large, wide, flat brush will do for this. Grab a couple of your colors, and in this case we're gonna do rust, but this time apply the pigment directly to the paintbrush like you can see me doing here. I should mention that this brush has also been pre-wetted a little bit, but the excess water have been pretty much completely removed. Don't try this with a completely dry brush. Now starting from the top of the direction you want your streaks to go, rapidly drag your brush across the surface and you'll see it leave some really nice crisp streaks. The downside of this though is that you have to keep reapplying that pigment quite often. As you can see here, we're now completely out of pigment and it's no longer leaving any streaks on the surface. The streaking technique is one of my favorite techniques to use because it's super easy to achieve great looking results with very little effort. And even better, since we're working with watercolor pencils here, it's very easy to clean up if you happen to make a mistake. So if you take these different techniques and you put them together while you're working on your model, you'll quickly find that you can get quite a wide array of effects using nothing but these simple techniques. Just take your time, work your way around the model, apply it in the little nooks and crannies and the little places where dirt and grime would collect, and before you know it, you got yourself an entirely weathered model. But the area of application doesn't just end with rust and oxidization in general. You can use this for adding dirt, grime, filters, modulating colors on surfaces. As long as you have a wide enough range of colors to work with, your own imagination is pretty much the limit to what type of effect can be achieved. If you do end up trying out this technique, there are a couple of things that you need to keep in mind. As this dries, it does lighten up quite a bit, so don't be afraid to go heavy on your applications while you're doing this. And if you happen to go a little bit too light, you can always go back over it. Just remember, it is water activated and you can reactivate the pigments when you're working on it, so I would recommend if you're going to do multiple applications, go ahead and seal it in between applications. Well, that's the video. I hope some of the information presented during this video have been helpful to you. I am Stargoat, and this has been my video on watercolor pencil weathering.